Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review As the Gods Will. So, I went into this movie because, of course, I'd watched the whole first season of the show, Squid Game. And all of a sudden, I heard there was a lot of people making comparisons to both Squid Game and this movie, and I'm just like, well, I need to go see this movie then. I need to understand what people are saying. And I went into it and I'm like, oh yeah, it is. Like, there's bits and pieces of it that feel similar, but, like, really that's just the beginning part of the film. And then this consistently goes into this, like, offshoot of a thing. So I can see where people could probably say that this movie is close, but no cigar. Uh, Going into this film, I really did enjoy it. I thought it was really fun, especially when all of a sudden we have like people who are all of a sudden like people's heads are marbles and several people's body parts just shoot out into being marbles. That was weird. Uh, so I really enjoyed this movie. And where could people go out of your way to find this film? You can do any number of things. One, this movie is actually somewhere on YouTube. You can probably find it and possibly watch the whole thing there, because that's the real, true, legitimate bootleg version of movie. I don't think that you can probably find it dubbed over in English because I searched. But you could possibly find a movie that is dubbed in subtitles in YouTube for free, because people like to tend to do that. Or you can go into an actual legitimate option, and you can go into this app called VU Voodoo. So VUDU Voodoo, check that out, and you can watch this movie in English dubbed, which means that you can hear people speak in English throughout that movie, and it has a tagline on it for $14.99 at the second of this recording. But if you want to see a movie, I'm not trying to like sponsor. I'm not getting any kind of money for this being sold. I'm just mentioning, hey, if you want an easy option where you can watch a whole entire movie in English, and it's just like the Squid Game, similar kind of thing. But anyways, there's that. Or you can see it the regular version, however you want. Or you can just go into like bootleg apps and then just be completely voided of any kind of fees and just watch it subtitled, because that's the only version I could find. Because I went in and there's apps I've been consistently using called Letter C Movies or Yes Movies. And I know these might be severely difficult to find. You might have to Google search them if you've never gone into finding these. Letter C Movies. So you could probably Google search them, find them fairly easily, download these apps, and then eventually go and probably watch this movie in subtitled. Because it's a freer option. It's an option so you don't have to pay at all. Anyways, so with that all said, what is this movie about? So, it seems that this movie is to be focused upon... We have a bunch of kids who end up all going to school one day, and then all of a sudden it seems that their school is to be kind of sealed up by some entity of sorts. Like they kept saying that it's either maybe alien or could be a higher power of sorts that we are not familiar of. And there is this real, true, legitimate question about if this is actually God or whoever. Because eventually they end up calling these kids God's children for whatever reason. Like as if they were like spoon-fed this name from somewhere, but they just came up with it. Because I guess they were to be the chosen ones. And so I guess there is some God or some seemingly absurdly powerful being that is to eventually take these kids And eventually, once they get out of their school, they get eventually sent into this cube into the sky, and then they just kind of like the cube just keeps floating around with these kids until this game is over, and then eventually these kids are to be sent back to the world towards the end of it, but they're to be sent to the world to eventually see some entity, and then the movie ends. So, with that said, we end up having these games that are consistently to be played. We have, of course, the very first game that we end up having is to be attached to this doll here. It's to be kind of like a red light, green light kind of game, and so that's why it's kind of familiar to Squid Game. But eventually you'll see that we're gonna like get into kind of different things. It seems that also every single one of these games do seemingly have a time limit. So hence why this is very much familiar to Squid Game, as every one of the Squid Game games had a time limit also. So here's also one thing that I found out because I had to go and try to figure out how to talk and say whatever the heck that these things are to actually be. Like the actual monster, or like whatever the game was, what they actually were. Like if they had an actual name or something like that, I had to go and find or figure that out. So, with that said, let's say this. So, eventually, we have these games that incorporate these big, huge, monstrous creatures, or like, and there's always some kind of weird, goofy goal that is to be placed within every single one of these games. And if you go into the trailers, you'll kind of figure out that there's kind of like weird things that eventually they go into here. And if you carry on to just kind of hear the spoiler part of this movie, then eventually you'll know what each game of those are. It's kind of really goofy to try to mention them all now. Like we end up having a red light, green light situation in the very beginning, and then the next round is to be some kind of like athletic kind of game where it's purposely to be put into a gym and having some kind of athletic kind of basketball-esh like task. So I can say that. Then the next thing, eventually once these people get to round 2 or the round 3, eventually it's just a guessing game reasonably. And to just kind of hope for the best and eventually get a key out of that. And the next thing that they are to have after that is to be this like to tell the truth kind of game, where you either have to be honest or you have to lie. And if someone does lie within the group that you're in, you have to figure out who the liar is. And so the very last game of this movie is to be this like traditional like kick the can kind of thing, which I've never heard. Like I've kind of heard of kick the can, but I've never seen it played in my life. Never have I known what kick the can actually was, and even when they kind of explain this to me, I'm like, okay, well, like this seems interesting, but would I have ever played kick the can? Probably not. Because it's like, what I still don't get what this movie, what the whole last thing of it is. But let's just say also that this movie really does, most of the kind of game elements, the monsters or the whoever, bizarrely most of these things eventually also in the culture of which that I'm not heavily familiar with. It seems like most of these entities, most of these dolls, or most of these things that are presented here are mostly to have like a good luck symbol to them. So I thought that was really interesting. And so, because eventually I had to like Google these, and like eventually you like go like, oh, this looks similar to whatever this is. So what is this actually? And so I went in and find out that some of this stuff was actually good luck charms. I'm like, okay, all right, interesting enough. So anyways, uh, let's hopefully go into this. More than likely, I'm not going to know every single character's name because there's a large group of people, and eventually it diminishes and diminishes and diminishes. And plus, also, I know that I'm probably going to ill pronounce something in the spoiler variation. That's bound to happen. And always there is just to be somebody that's just like, oh, it's pronounced this. And I'm like, great, I'm not even reviewing this anymore. I don't even care after this point in time about an ill pronouncing thing, and I'm not going to go back and try to correct something that I said. So I'm going to obviously probably butcher a name of anything, um, simply because I just don't want to take the time to find out the perfect pronunciation, or really there's just a time of which that like I would anyways pushing on. So let's go into this. Let's go into that double five time territory because it is that customary time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we didn't to spoil this movie. So we begin this movie weirdly with this Daruma doll who is to be placed in this classroom, and nobody's really understanding what the heck is going on. And so all of a sudden, people start moving, and the Daruma doll is like, "Ha!" And so he ends up going and marbleizing these people's heads or clothes or whichever. We get this weird shot where, like, this one girl is to be like shot from almost like skirt down, and you just see like these marbles falling, and it just looks hilarious because I'm like, this looks like the marbles are coming from out of this girl's dress, and it looks hilarious. And I think they did that shot on purpose to look funny. But it's obviously coming from this girl's head instead of her skirt. But like that shot was just priceless. So anyways, so these guys are not knowing what's going on. They're just like they're to be staying like dead solid, just like I'm not going to move. I'm going to be a mannequin right now and not say a word or whatever until eventually this Daruma doll goes and turns back around and isn't looking at me. Because we end up having this Daruma doll who is go and like consistently say his name and to say that he's coming, and then he ends up turning around. A lot of times he ends up kind of stretching it out to eventually say it slower or to eventually sing it or to eventually whatever to make it stretch out longer for these people eventually to try and get to him because there's going to be a whole reason for that. So now we have to stop this scene and pull back a little bit for really just going into the day, like how we got here kind of thing. So we end up having this one main character who is to be a guy named Shun. I'm going to try to do name pronouncing in the easiest way possible. So, we end up having Shun, who is to be spotted eventually going into this video game store, and he ends up making a friend because his friend is to tell Shun, it's like, hey, like, you trying to steal those video games? Like, if anything, you probably shouldn't steal that one because that one's really boring. Like, hey man, but also if you're gonna like steal these video games, be smart about it. Like, be in an aisle that has less cameras. And so both of these guys go off and they go and steal these video games, and they end up walking out of the store. But these guys instantly make friends. So it seems like Shun had not been in school for a real good while, and like possibly for about like a month or so. Like he has just not been in school, I guess, because something had happened, obviously, to where this guy was just like, I don't want to go to school. Like, I don't really care. So, like, he consistently tells his mother that he's going back tomorrow. And she's like, okay, all right. So, Shun goes back to school and is to meet his friend. And so, eventually, this friend is in his class with him. And so, all of a sudden, like, we have seemingly a normal day where all of a sudden this teacher is like, okay, guys, like, open up your textbooks to page 484 or something like that and just get ready for the day. And all of a sudden, this teacher's head just, like, just blows up. And that's when we have the Daruma doll ending up, like, coming out of this guy's head weirdly and plopping down onto this desk. And I'm like, okay, that is such a weird thing. Did the Daruma doll crush the teacher's head? Was the Daruma doll the teacher the whole time? I'm so confused. But it doesn't really matter. It just, like, is a spot where maybe the Daruma doll had the power to kill this teacher. And I don't know. Anyways, so pushing on. So now we're back in this classroom and they're trying to figure out what the heck is going on because the Daruma doll is like, Daruma, come. And so the Daruma doll is to eventually flip and to see that nobody's moving. But there's sometimes when people are trying to hope that they can go and escape from some door and open some door, but the doors aren't opening. And so the Daruma doll turns and, of course, see these guys trying to desperately open this door, and he kills them both. Some girls end up freaking out, and so they end up obviously dying. So, eventually, seemingly after this whole, or quite a good portion of this class is killed because they don't understand what's going on. Eventually, we have one guy with glasses who ends up kind of figuring things out. That he's like, wait a minute, like, let's realize this, that one, on the back of the Daruma doll, there is to be a timer. And also there's to be this weird, like, thing that might be a button on the back of this doll. And so maybe we should press that button, and maybe that will stop all of this. And so people are just like, okay, that sounds reasonable. Like, who's going to get up there? Because there's too many marbles all over the gosh darn floor to be able to make it up there fairly quickly. So all of a sudden there's to be one guy who ends up like, I can do it. I'll get it. And all of a sudden once he tries to hit the button, the Daruma doll turns, and so that guy is dead. And so all of a sudden, like, time is ticking down, and then they're like, oh my god, like, how can we just beat this? And so Shun's friend is, like, kind of looking at him, and he's saying, like, man, we need to go and, like, team up together, and you need to go, and, like, I'll give you a boost, and you go flying, and you go and hit that button, because, like, we have seemingly, like, any time left. So all of a sudden Shun is like marbling his way through the floor to eventually jump on this guy's back. He goes flying, he's like, yeah, I'm gonna hit the button, yeah, and then he ends up hitting the button as Daruma's like slowly but surely, like, time has slowed down, as like Daruma's like, he's almost gonna turn, and so Shun hits this button. And all of a sudden, like, Daruma's like, like, game over. Like, Shun is still alive. Game over. So, all of a sudden, what ends up happening is Shun, out of this entire classroom, was the only one who survived. So, the other classmate that gave him the boost to be able to have him hit this button, his head ended up coming off. Because, like, both Shun and his friend were just like, yeah, we did it. Like, they were thumbs upping, and they're like, yeah, we did it. And all of a sudden, Shun's friend, his head ends up coming off, and so he's like, F you. He's giving him the finger. And so, uh, and then, like, the guy obviously dies. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. So, we end up finding anyone left who was to be alive at this point in this classroom died. And Shun was the only one to live because he hit the button. So, eventually, Shun is to figure out a way to get out of this classroom, obviously through a door, to eventually bump into another student who is uh, Ichika, which is kind of the like red-headed girl that it seemed that Shun was to seemingly be interested in, like making her his girlfriend. But because like she's riding on her bike in the beginning of this movie, and Sean is like, well, maybe someday I'll ask her out. Maybe someday like we'll be together and stuff like that. Which I'm like, dude, I wouldn't put your cards on that right now with this whole death scenario at any moment. So, so we weirdly have this. So we weirdly have the uh, Duramo or Durama doll, who is to eventually tell that these two eventually need to run because the cat is coming after them. It's like, okay, whatever that means. So that ends up transitioning us because these people are going throughout this entire part of this school, and they're just remembering the Doramo doll mentioning that, like, hey, like, you better run because you're a mouse and the cat is going to come after you. And it's like, what does that even mean? And why is it that any of these people should have easily figured out where the next game was? Because how would they have known where the game was? That is just so, like, you had to bank on people getting to a certain part of this school, and that is the kind of absurdity about this movie. What if these people would have never went into this part of this school, and they just like went into the lunchroom and just like ate like nobody's business? Just been like, yeah, hey, like since everybody's dead, I guess I can eat all the pizza I want because it's pizza day anyways, right? Like, yeah, yeah, like they just really bank on these people who luckily all found one room and whatever. So the next step is to have all of these people end up in this gym because that's the only door that opened and closed. So these people head in the gym and then the door closes behind them. I'm like, oh crap. So Shen and Ichika are to be kind of stuck in here. And so weirdly, we have this class president who is telling everybody and the brother to put on this mouse costume because maybe if they don't put on the mouse costume, they'll be breaking the rules of whatever this game is. So both Shen and his girly are to just kind of not go about that rule and just kind of wait to see what happens because they don't know what's going on. So all of a sudden, bizarrely, this gym floor opens up like the Quinjet from X-Men, the X-Men movies. Like the kind of like the basketball hoop situation. We have like a Quinjet coming out of the basketball hoop or the basketball court in the X-Men movie. It's kind of like the same thing here where all of a sudden this gym is to just have this open up thing on the floor of it, and all of a sudden we end up having coming out this thing called a Menki Nico Meiki Nico statue, which I'm definitely going to be ill pronouncing that. If I'm ballparkingly close, it's basically, like I had seen this thing currently on Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where we have this cat who has this like arm who ends up kind of rotating back and forth, and it's a cat statue of a thing, and so it's this giant cat statue thing that has the hand, whatever. So we end up having this giant cat who ends up coming from the floor of this gym, weirdly, bizarrely, and whichever. And so all of a sudden, this cat is to weirdly, on right by its neck, is to have this like basketball hoop attached to it. And supposedly the object of the game is to connect the bell to the cat. And you have a basketball hoop, and eventually you end up having all of a sudden a giant bell that has a timer on it that is to eventually be chucked in there like a basketball hoop to get into the basketball hoop of this cat's neck and resolve all this. But here is the goofy problem. It seems that eventually a lot of this game, you kind of have to disguise certain kind of things, or eventually you have to kind of trick people, and that's what it really comes down to. So, this giant statue cat ends up first going after every single person that is dressed like a mouse. And so one of the people figure that out, and so they end up telling the people, hey, like, no one wear the mouse costumes, take them all off. Because she's only going after the people dressed as mouses. Because the two people were right there, both Shen and his girlfriend, Ichika, and they weren't attacked by the cat. And obviously the cat was looking right at them. But she went off. So all of a sudden this cat has this long slinky of a neck, and all of a sudden just goes and grabs people and freaking jumps on people and squishes people. And I'm just like, oh my god, this is really cool. So all of a sudden, like eventually everyone is to take the mouse costumes off, and so eventually we find out that the cat is now changing to just go after all the humans because recently she would have only gone after the mouse people, but they took all their costumes off. So like maybe Shen shouldn't have said anything. Just be like, hey man, I'm gonna be saved for last. Good for me. But no, he was nice and told the people to take all their costumes off. So all of a sudden we get one point where Ichira or Ichika was almost to eventually get eaten by the big cat, and let's just call it Nico. I hope that's pronouncing it correctly somehow, ballparkingly, whichever. The Nico statue, because I'm not even going to try to pronounce the first thing. So Nico is almost going after Ichika, and Shen all of a sudden decides, well, like, I'm going to try to protect this girl, and I'm going to put on this mouse costume, so that way this thing will chase after me, and I'm pretty speedy. I can really get going on this, and I can really just, put some work in on this cat. So, really, Shen's idea really does actually work out, because all of a sudden, it seems that he is to be somehow linked to this cat, and supposedly the cat would be meowing for whatever reason. And so all of a sudden, when Shen is put on the mouse costume, all of a sudden he ends up realizing that this cat is to mention that he is severely itchy, and if this cat could get scratched, then he would go to sleep. And so they're like, oh my god, we figured it out. Because we end up having this one kid who is to just naturally assume, because he took this one basketball and he ends up shooting it into the hoop of the cat, and he ends up making it. And so he's like, hey man, like, I'm pretty good at basketball. I've trained for seemingly forever. So hey, like, toss me the bell and I'll chuck it into the hoop and we'll be done with this. So the kid goes and gets the bell, chucks it into uh, the hoop, and before it goes in, all of a sudden the cat ends up grabbing it with its hands, and they're like, "Oh crap! The cat can actually like defend her neck, or just grab the bell." So like they're like, "God, do we seriously have to like crawl onto this cat and eventually go and chuck that in there?" Like we end up seeing that there is this like string or whatever that is on the back of this thing's like neck. I would have taken the string, like I would have crawled up and scratched the cat, and then I would have taken the string and just kind of looped around, and then had the basketball in or the bell in hand and chucked it in there that way, and game done, set, match, whatever. But what ends up happening is that Shen starts to realize that he can go and get behind the cat and start scratching it heavily. And so, like, the cat, it's going okay, but she, like, is to be really itchy. And so all of a sudden, like, most of the class members all get up there and start heavily scratching this cat. And I'm like, how is this really working? But so the cat ends up falling over and falling asleep. And so they're like, hey man, we can easily do the bell now. Like, go ahead, let's go for it. But all of a sudden, stupid people are all thinking that they're like, wait a minute, what happens if uh if eventually one person is to shoot the hoop, make it, and everyone else dies? And so everyone else starts to fight over the bell, and we have like the stupid class president that thinks that he is to eventually get the bell because he's class president. I'm like, dude, that was dead. Like, as soon as this game started, you're no longer class president. You're no one. Like, you're a guy that is meant to get eaten or killed or whatever. Like, you're just cannon fodder. Like, it doesn't matter, like, who you are now. But, like, we rarely have this guy who thinks that he's class president and he should be able to get whatever he wants. Doesn't work that way, buddy. So, so what ends up happening is that Shen and his girl end up having an idea. They end up going into this little side room because they find like a basketball that's kind of deflated and crushed and whatever, and that like blew up. So what they end up doing is they end up trying to disguise the bell from the cat, and so they end up disguising this bell with these mouse costumes, and so they end up running up, and so all of a sudden the cat is to see in Shen's hand that there is to be a basketball in that hand. So the cat is immediately assuming that the girl actually has the legitimate ball, and so she's like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go and just squash this girl from getting this ball into my net. Not kill the girl, just kind of like deck her so that way she doesn't make the shot or whatever. So all of a sudden we end up finding out that the bell was actually disguised underneath the basketball, and Shen chucks out the basketball slash bell to eventually go into the hoop without the cat realizing it. And then it's like, oh, game over. You guys are alive. Like, everyone is to be alive, so they all made it. So all of a sudden, the cat really like releases this gas, and so here's now where all of a sudden we end up having like TV talking about this giant floating cube that is in the sky, that there's nothing that they can do about it. Evidently, there's this presence beyond their comprehension that is kind of having this cube float in the air with all of these students from all of these schools. evidently there is to be so many schools from so many different places, like I guess New York, Moscow, and any number of places. Like, I'm sorry if I only just mentioned two, and maybe there was like, oh well, they said this too. They said four or five other things, which the only one I remembered was like really just the first like one. I knew it was New York. Well, that was the only thing I remembered, and then anything after that was just like wherever that was. So so going on, so flu. So so floating cube. That's what I was trying to say. It's a flu. Man, that flu was just a big flu. It was like a tesseract in the air. That flu. Anyways, so maybe they could go and they could do an American version of this movie. They kind of like it could probably be a sequel of this film, but it also can be related, like whichever, or it could just be a remake, an American remake, because Netflix will probably go and copy and paste and do a show that is just like this, right? Because they love copying and pasting things. No offense, Netflix, and your big giant wallet of money that can slap me in the face at any moment. But as long as some money falls out, that's okay. As long as some money just trickles out, I'm like, okay, yeah, real money. Anyways, pushing on. Sell out. Joking. Anyways, uh, so these kids eventually are to supposedly in the news be called God's children for whatever reason. Because evidently they're to be chosen ones, or it's just some weird title that bizarrely people gave them for whatever reason. What if nobody would have figured out the game and every single person would have died? Would the thing just have moved on to a much more intelligent crop of people? I'm confused. Like, I guess you could probably find an entire state of people. You could probably find some smart people in a specific state. But I don't know, like maybe they chose the wrong people. So, going on. So, the next thing, we end up seeing eventually these kids waking up in this weird place. And so eventually there's to be some people that are trying to figure things out, but also it seems like they got a hit of a thing and they can watch TV for whatever reason. And so eventually this kid who's kind of like going on his laptop trying to figure things out, trying to figure out how they can escape and something like that, like some kind of vectors or something like that, because supposedly the military is also trying to figure out how they can get into this cube and eventually try and help these kids escape somehow or another. But it seems that no one can quite figure this out. So, eventually all these kids think about or all these kids care about is escaping, and it's like, dude, if anybody in the Brother can't get in here, how are we expecting to get out? It's not gonna happen. Like, I don't think it's possible. So, cue up the next game. So, the next game is to be a game where you're supposed to figure out who is behind you while these things are, and these things are to be called, Kokenshi dolls? Kokenshi? Am I saying that right? Kokenshi? Evidently these are other dolls that are to be, eventually to be singing this song and rotating around a person. For probably American people, like to me, this kind of feels like Duck Duck Goose without anybody choosing Goose and somebody running around the thing. Like, but anyways, pushing on. So eventually what ends up happening, so these dolls all circle around this one person, and so eventually what ends up happening is eventually they're to sing this song, and you know what I like, and they also have to supposedly figure out who out of this entire group is to be an idiot to eventually get a key from these people. So eventually we have, of course, a couple people trying to figure out the game, and they can't figure it out. They're just like, so and so, and they're like, I'm sorry, you're wrong. And so all of a sudden we end up having one of the dolls who ends up freaking like laser beaming into these people's heads to bizarrely control them. Like the one guy, he ends up getting laser beamed into the head, and all of a sudden he ends up going and like he's lost all control of his body, and so now he's forcing himself to bash his head against this wall or against this floor numerous times over to eventually break his skull. Which I'm like, oh my god, like this is awesome. Horrifically. And then the next girl is to be chosen, and so she ends up getting it wrong also. And so what they end up doing with her is we have laser beam coming out of Doll's eyes again. And so this girl is to be forced to do the splits, but that's not all. All of a sudden, this girl is to be consistently pulled between her legs to pull even farther. So it's not enough that this girl did the splits. Both of her legs are getting pulled apart from her. And so this girl is basically getting ripped apart from downtown, if you know what I mean. I'm like, oh my god, that has got to be like the worst possible death, because like freaking your legs are probably eventually going to get ripped off, because I can't imagine that like you're just going to all of a sudden like just split in half. Your body, I don't think, quite works that way. So this girl is eventually probably going to have her legs freaking get ripped off, and then after that is going to have to probably just bleed out horrifically, probably pushing on. So, but I don't know, maybe there's some kind of weird bodily thing that they can just laserly do that just rips this person's body weirdly in half for whatever reason. Anyways, pushing on. So it gets to a rotation of people, and we also have this one moment where there was to be this one character before school started that day, where we end up seeing this one kid who just beats the crap out of all students. And eventually we'll end up seeing him still alive in this game, and eventually he'll just kill other students. Like, we get to one point where reasonably this guy goes and knifes a bunch of these mouse students, and it's to basically just mention like, hey, like this works perfectly for me, like this new world where I can just kill anybody I want and there's no rules. So because this guy is to purposely kill people, because the only one that he is to care about is just having him be left, because that's eventually what's going to pretty much happen anyways for him in his own mind, is he wants to be the only one left anyways to kind of speed this whole thing up. So eventually what ends up happening is that Shen is to go up, and so Shen is kind of studying these things. It seems that also he's doing some goofy thing with his cell phone. And so eventually Shen is to eventually have these things circle around him, and we're assuming that he's going to die. So all of a sudden we end up having Shen, who is supposed to guess. And he's like, oh, and so all of a sudden we end up hearing time's up. And we're like, oh my god, Shen is going to die. So all of a sudden, we have Shen who is to be like, well, wait a minute, like, no, like, if anything, like, I figured out who is behind me, plus also I figured out who the idiot of these dolls are, and it is to actually be the one like girl with the kind of the rosy cheeks and the kind of the red coloring. Because we end up finding out that this girl was to be the girl who ends up saying time's up on one thing before, and this girl evidently can't recognize her own voice being said, and so she ends up saying that time's up from a cell phone recording of her voice. And so all of a sudden Shen is to realize that this is the one idiot out of the whole group because she can't recognize her own voice, and she thought that somebody else said that time's up, but it was actually her. So not only does Shen get the name of his of the person behind him correct because he realized and figured out the rotation. I think it is probably kind of simple because really all it does is like, okay, you can kind of figure out like who is the like the people in front of you and the person behind you, and so when you put the mask on, like you can just kind of time the rotation to eventually just go like, okay, well, it has to be this person by the time that this song is up. Every single time it's the same, like, timing or the same rotation or the same whatever. So eventually you should be able to figure out, regardless of who it is, every single time. Because eventually you should be like, oh, okay, well, I've seen other people do it, and no one could figure out the rotation and the perfectly timed thing to just be like, okay, well, by this time, it should be like, okay, like, this one's here, this one's here, this one's here, and so, like, I'm just waiting for this one person to eventually make their way behind me, and I can just easily say who they are. So, Shen beats that, Shen ends up getting the key, and so we weirdly go on into this kind of, like, this little stretch of hallways where all of a sudden, like, people come back and they all have these keys. So Shun, have I been saying Shen this whole time? Shun. Shun eventually goes and finds one of his classmates that he hasn't seen in a number of years. He's like, "Oh, hey, great! Like, it's nice to see you again." I think her name was Shuko. Shuko. If I'm Shouko. Shuko. Am I saying that correctly? Ballparkingly. I believe that's who that is. Yikes! Names are complicated. So Shun is to go with this girl, and so all of a sudden they're kind of just walking through these hallways, trying to see if they can find anybody, kind of team up with whoever. And so all of a sudden there's to be this one guy running for his life from this other weird monster, this like doll or monster doll of whatever, like some weird goofy looking like doll that is going to kill this guy. So this guy is to run and tell these guys like, we need to hold hands. So all of a sudden all three of them all hold hands, and so this doll buggers off because like, oh, I'm so lonely, I need to just kill somebody, because evidently that's his goal, is eventually if like this person can't like hold hands with anybody, someone ends up dying. So eventually we get these kids to just start roaming around and whichever. So eventually there is to be another girl that ends up getting caught by this doll, and so like Shun rips away from the two friends he's holding hands with to eventually go and grab his supposedly girlfriend. Maybe he ends up grabbing her hand, and then the doll stops and like, oh, I'm so lonely, and he walks away. So all of a sudden all these people are still alive, and so they're just kind of roaming through this place because they have nothing better to do. So all of a sudden this thing that is going to be complicated to have because I don't have an exact name for this, all of a sudden we end up having this like huge yellow ball that ends up like crashing through this wall like Kool-Aid. Oh yeah. Like half of this yellow ball is to be sticking out of this wall. And so all of a sudden, they are to need supposedly 7 keys and 7 people, supposedly. So what ends up happening is they're like, okay, we need all the keys. Like, we need to figure out who all has these keys, who came and beat all these missions. And so all of a sudden, we end up seeing the one guy who is to just be this unsavory character that just kills everyone and just easily gets away with it because there's no rules here. So this guy has seemingly a ton of the keys. He has like 3 of them, and so they're like, "Oh my god, that's all we needed." And so the one guy that he was with, he ends up going and snapping this guy's neck because, like, well, I didn't need him anymore, anyways, because now we're here. So they end up putting all the keys in, and so all of a sudden, this yellow ball that has this smiley face on it ends up backing away, and this weirdly had a time limit on it also. So this ball ends up backing away, and so they end up just going like, well, I guess we should just go and head further on into whatever this is. So they end up going into this kind of icy or cold like environment. And so all of a sudden there is to be this big white bear that is to appear and to be this giant like CGI like character. He looks like kind of a polar bear, but it also looks like this thing was made out of like some kind of like rock, like so it was like a rock polar bear kind of thing, where consistently when this bear would have to talk, like his whole body would like have to like shift whenever he's talking, like his bot like if he were to be moving his eyebrows, like his eyebrows would have to like slint or whatever. Like, it looks really cool or really interesting. But anyways, so this bear is to mention about that he likes people who are to just kind of be like white and pure people. And so he wants every single one of these people, when asked a question, for them to all tell them, or to tell one another, but also tell him the truth, the absolute truth. Because if there's anybody to be a liar here, they have to go and accuse this person, and so the bear can kill this person. So the only people that are left are to be the honest people. So very first question is to be like, hey, what's your favorite food? And they're like, seriously, that's what the questions are? That's kind of weird. So all of a sudden people start going on and eventually like answering the question. Some people say sushis, somebody says parsley, one person says meat, one person says any number of things. So eventually they answer this whole question, and we end up having the bear who's like, liar, somebody's a liar in this group. I'm so angry because there's liars here. And so all of a sudden we have one person who is to just kind of figure out the game much quicker than anyone else is. But like, he's not going to mention what's going on. So all of a sudden one person is to accuse the guy who ends up saying parsley, and it's like, parsley? Seriously, bro? Like, you love parsley? You just like, parsley all day long? Like, seriously? And like, there's some people that have real, luckily, like, some people could kind of like say it's like, definitely this is this guy's favorite food, he eats it all the time. I see him in lunch just going or whatever. That wasn't the parsley guy. So let me pause here for a second. Let me do a reset. All right. So eventually they all accuse, or the majority of people accuse the parsley guy of being a liar. And so the bear just squishes him to death with his fist. And so we go on to the next question of who is to Shun, yes or no. So we go around, and so everyone is to kind of say it's like, well, the one girl is to mention, like, of course, like Shun's possible girlfriend. She's to mention it's like, well, hey, like there's sometimes like I feel like I can have feelings for this boy, so I guess I have to say yes. To where it's like Shun is like, yeah, like if we get out of here, bang it a bang, bang bang bang. Anyways, why is it just like all that they would do is just bang it out? They would go to the movies. They mentioned at the end of this that like really they're gonna do everything innocent. That really they're gonna go out on a night out of town and whatever. So I just thought it would be funny if I was like, yeah, they're just gonna go and bang it a bang, bang bang bang. Anyways, pushing on. So so eventually, what ends up happening is that everybody answers again, and so the bear is like, a liar! Like, I hate liars. I hate when people are to be like the black hearted people of whatever. And so all of a sudden, eventually, people are to accuse this one girl who is to be chucking these cups against this wall early on in this movie because I guess evidently it's fun because there's no rules, and so you guess might as well chuck cups against this wall for whatever reason because just break a bunch of things. So, and weirdly, this girl has this cup necklace. So eventually, what ends up happening is this girl ends up getting crushed as well. And so now Shun has figured out the game. And so Shun is like, wait a minute. Before the next question, I know who the liar is. I figured it out. And I've solved this whole thing. So the rest of us could all be alive. So the bear is like, okay, great. Who is it? We really also have this one thing also that ends up speaking the timer thing. I don't know what the heck that thing was. Like I don't know what it was. I just know it like bizarrely broke in half by the end of this. But it would like talk and see what the timer was, but I didn't know what that thing was. It was like I don't know. So if anybody knows what it is, let me know in the comments below because it won't matter to me past this point, but I guess for someone else who eventually goes and watches this, but like, oh yeah, that was a whatever piece of thing that eventually fell out of the polar bear slash bear thing. So, anyways, pushing on. So Shunfit had figured it out that the liar is to not be any one of the actual humans, it's to be the bear itself. Because the bear had done this whole trick thing, and eventually we find out the more that this bear is to crush people, that all of a sudden there is to be some kind of black part of this bear, and so like he's been lying this whole time. And so eventually Shun figures it out, and the bear all of a sudden turns from a white bear to this black bear, and all of a sudden this like goop falls from its eye, the one remaining last white piece. And so that all of a sudden means that anybody who is left here is to make it to the next round. So the next and final round is to be the kick the can game. So what ends up happening is we end up having these things called the Matryoshka dolls? Matryoshka. But Mashkra I know I'm going to ill pronounce that. Go ahead and anything that I'm to ill pronounce through this, go ahead and comment on what the pronunciation of it is, because I'm probably never going to read it or respond or whichever. Like it's like most of the stuff about the movie or something I said is incorrect. Like it's a movie, it's a one-off thing. and I'm probably not gonna read the comments in all brutal honesty. So if I mispronounce something, I'm not gonna go and look at a comment to see the correct pronunciation of something. It's done. It's done and over with. Especially if it's a movie. If it's a show, I'll just be like, oh, okay, like I'll just remember that for the next episode. But this is a one-off thing, so I have this freedom to just ignore. But it doesn't matter to me. Um, but like again, for anyone else who wants this knowledge, maybe they're gonna go into this movie after this. Maybe they want the correct pronunciation, and I'm saying it wrong. So, anyways, pushing on. So eventually, we have these dolls. These seemingly they look like Russian dolls for me because eventually they keep uh, kind of like popping out of one another, and so we have these like three dolls. So they look like Russian dolls to me, but like that's where I would normally have known these things from. But I don't know the Russian doll Matryoshka difference or uh, Matryoshka difference. I'm sorry about that pronunciation. I'm not doing it purposely. I'm doing accidentally. So and but me continuing to say it is a mistake also. So pushing on. So these things come out and they are to cement the next game is to be kick the can. Evidently this can is to be up high, and we end up having the one guy that has kind of killed a number of people through this game. And plus he also had figured out the whole bear thing before anyone else did. He ends up being the demon or the bad guy in this game, where everyone else is to have to hide from this guy. And so, because they end up drawing straws, and so the one guy who's like, yeah, like I picked the perfect role because I'm like, heck yeah, like I'm going to, of course, uh, like be the bad guy here because I'm have been built up as a bad guy anyways. So kick the can. So what ends up happening is the demon is to go and kick this is to go and kick the doll, and all of a sudden the doll ricochets the can to go and fall for this guy can go and perfectly place where the can should be. Here's the thing though. Supposedly they mentioned that this can, if it were to get kicked, would eventually explode. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, this guy took and kicked this doll, which ricocheted which hit this can and had the can fall over. Wouldn't that have exploded the can and the game would have been over? Kind of really wrecks the movie now, doesn't it? But so the kid places the can, and so all these people go out and hide. So all of a sudden, the bad guy, the guy that they end up calling the demon, or the demon here, he ends up going and, of course, easily going and finding two guys because they didn't hide really all that well. And plus, this guy is absurdly strong, anyways. So it just kind of gets to the point where it seems that Shun and his girlfriend are kind of hiding out. And so he ends up getting this rope and is trying to rope his way out of this room. And sadly enough, Shun's girlfriend ends up getting picked off too. So Shun is, the demon is to mention that, like, hey man, like, all I needed to do was just get three people and I win. And so, like, hey man, like, you can just come out here because you're gonna lose anyways. But supposedly, if the good guy is to kick the can and free all the prisoners, then he ends up winning the game. So that's the whole thing. But on the opposite side, the bad guy is to see a person's face and then call out their name and then take them to this prison place and then win. So what ends up happening is Shun ends up eventually going out and is to eventually try to make his stand against this guy. He's bizarrely wearing this like knight armor from head to toe, and I'm like, okay, what does this all mean? And so this guy's going out here with this knight armor, trying to like, yeah, I'm strong, like beat me. And so all of a sudden we have the demon guy, the bad guy, who ends up getting closer and closer to Shun. And so what all of a sudden Shun does is he ends up latching this chain around the demon guy, and Shun then goes and falls off to the side of this little kind of balcony thing, falling into this water. And so now we have forcibly the demon guy who is to drag this body like back up to eventually try and win this game, or to collect this guy, even though he really doesn't have to, but he's just kind of stuck here either way. So the guy is to grab this chain and consistently keep pulling for us all of a sudden to realize that Shun is no longer in this armor, and so this guy is just pulling up dead weight. And so all of a sudden we end up seeing Shun, who I guess had been able to quickly kind of climb this little balcony thing to make his way back up, to eventually go and eventually slowly but surely, but then eventually run, to eventually go and kick this can to free his people. Because even though obviously this guy had seen Shun's face and called out his name and say he was captured, I guess because this guy didn't actually go and imprison him and the game would have been completely over that way, I guess like there was still an opportunity for Shun to kick this can and still win, technically, for whatever reason. So what ends up happening is Shun ends up kicking the can, and they just kind of brace themselves because they think that the can is going to explode, and the can doesn't explode. And the dolls are to mention that. They're to mention, it's like, oh no, we were just to say that to make the game much more exciting, but ha ha ha, that's a lie that we told you. It's like, like you could have been like honest, but I guess it was really to be like cautionary. Plus also Shun was to probably get worried that he was going to have to forcibly sacrifice himself to save his friends, because he was probably going to die. So the guy who is to go and like kill and beat up any number of people, he's thinking it's like, oh well, I lost then, right? So like I guess I'm going to have to die and everyone else is going to get set free. And they're all to say, oh no, like if anything, like there is no loser, there is no winner out of this whole thing. Like you guys have all just kind of just made it, like. And so like, oh, okay, great. So like basically the very last game was pointless, in all honesty. Like they were all just winners bizarrely at the end of this game for whatever reason. It didn't quite sit well with me. So one of the dolls ends up popping its lid to have all of these popsicles, and they're like, hey, like we're gonna shoot off some fireworks. You guys can all lick these popsicles, and after you finish all of these popsicles, you should be able to go home. And so like, okay, great. So like, the popsicle, yeah, and so eventually we have like Shun, who's going and talking to his girl, and he's like, hey, like maybe we can go out to the movies, or maybe we can go and like do something. It'll be really fun. Like, yeah, like we'll be able to live our lives after this. Here's the one thing that I thought was so interesting is Shun was talking about in the very beginning of this movie how boring his life is, and how reasonably like he hated his boring life. But then all of a sudden, this game popped off, and so Shun was all of a sudden just like, God, please give me back my boring life. And so, like, Shun just kind of continued to recite that as a mantra, like, God, please give me back my boring life. Uh, and so that was kind of like really interesting to me. So eventually, once we get to the very end of all this, and eventually, when everybody's to lick and eat and whatever their popsicle, eventually the popsicles are to also read something. And so each one of these sticks are to let people know whether they will continue to live or whether they will die. And so the dolls end up saying, like, well, hey, really, you guys can do all kinds of athletic things and all kinds of stuff. You can possibly figure something out. You can be smarter than everyone. You can be stronger. You can be whatever. But in the end, what it all really has to come down to is just blind luck. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? So we end up finding out of this group of people, only two were to be able to go back home, and everyone else was to die out of this group. And Shun and his girlfriend wasn't one of them. Meaning that Shun was to be one who lived, and the evil guy who had been killing and stabbing people throughout this entire movie, he lived also. But then eventually, because I guess what I think what ended up happening is I think they wanted this balance of good and evil to make it back. And then whoever else that were just kind of side characters or really didn't matter or wasn't the focus character, they ended up just dying off at the end. So all of a sudden, we end up having the two guys and Shun's girlfriend being killed off, and so then we end up having the two guys go and make it back to Earth. I think they're on this like Eiffel Tower or some kind of tower, some weird monument tower thing. So I don't know what the actual thing was. It looks like the Eiffel Tower, but I don't know what the actual thing is. For whatever reason, it looks just, I don't know what it is. Anyways, pushing on. So these guys make it back, and like I'm just thinking, wait a minute. What was the whole God's children thing, and like why were these people to have gone and done this whole thing? It kind of feels like a waste. Like, couldn't they have been like given superpowers or something? Like, why were they chosen just to be just sent back and just be like, oh, well, hey, like, we just wanted to just have fun for whatever reason, to just kill a bunch of people for no real reason. Like, I was just like, okay, that's the one thing that bugged the crap out of me. But then all of a sudden, like, Shun is just kind of talking about, like, well, hey, like I'm kind of upset with God. Like I'm just kind of like I don't know if I believe there is a God anymore. And so all of a sudden God weirdly just shows up and we end up seeing like a flash of his face and then the movie ends. I'm like, "Wait, what?" So we end up seeing a technical God for whatever reason. And then I'm like, "Okay, but why did we see God? Why?" To like was God kind of just sitting it out, and then eventually towards the end of this he's like, well, I guess I should probably just make an entrance, right? Because he was just consistently in his room just kind of doing things, and then he's like, okay, well, I gotta go out. So yeah, I was so confused by the very ending of this movie. Just be like, okay, well, I guess God should grant them something at the end of all this, because I guess to really just say that it was God doing this whole time instead of just maybe some alien entity, whichever. for whatever reason. Because I guess you can kind of break it all down of just like God is also like a person that tends to like smite a lot of people and kill off a lot of people to eventually, I guess, leave like I guess the whole survival of the fittest thing, or just really just the uh to boil it all down to just like kind of wipe out a lot of masses to eventually get to uh the highest potential of people that are left alive, I guess. I don't know. Trying to come up with some kind of like thought process of this whole thing, because I'm like, okay, so this movie just ends and we don't actually figure out why that these like what is the end goal thing that these people get at the end of this? Just a talk with God, and they're like, oh, okay, we'll see you later. Like, are they going to be like, what are they going to be after this? Like, if God was to come down and be like, hey, like, I'm going to give you some like some like anything that you want, like, give me super strength. Well, maybe no. Like, I would super strength would be good, but also like I would need to get around fairly easily. So I guess like if I could get two wishes, give me three. Might as well just give me three. Rule of thumb, I guess. Have me be able to have like super strength and then teleportation to be able to get everywhere easily. Like if I want to just appear just at any point in time of any place in the world, whichever. Like even if it meant that I could go and like teleport into a TV during a certain show or a certain scene to tell everybody like, "Hey, don't do that." Teleportation at its best. Just to kind of see a whole different movie done from a completely different way, because a lot of people tend in a lot of shows or movies make a lot of mistakes. So because that's bound to happen. So, super strength, teleportation, and then just I don't want to be greedy, but I guess like $1 million. Well, no, if you had superpowers, people definitely want to pay to see that kind of thing. So, no $1 million, just like, hey, have me get some kind of guy that could kind of help me eventually in the financial department. Give me some guy that eventually will promote whatever this superpower is, and like that'll be good enough. I don't know. I just wanted to end this with a goofy little thing. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. Let me know in the comments below if God would have appeared to you at the end of this whole thing. What would you have liked God to do, say, whichever? Maybe you'll get three wishes, and maybe you have to figure out what the three wishes are. I don't know. I don't know why God is bizarrely a genie, and then he's gonna bizarrely grant you things. Like he could just be like, dude, me talking to you, it should be like the golden ticket of life. Like you're the only person. Like, can you go and take a selfie with God? No one would believe that this is God, but like, uh, like you can have a selfie with God. That'd be kind of cool. Anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.